Recently I had a bit of a retro gaming panic attack. After reading this article from Retro RGB, which talks about how certain SNES games, in particular Star Fox, are at risk of being permanently damaged from leaking capacitors. Now I don't mean to be alarmist, but this did hit home just how temporary games can be, and reinvigorated my interest in finding a solution to have these games playable for the long haul. Of course, there is emulation, which, don't get me wrong, is a noble cause. I have nothing but respect for people in that scene. But for me, it just doesn't feel as good as playing on a dedicated console. That's why I've looked to flash carts to satisfy my needs, and in particular, the Everdrive line. I recently got the NES/Famicom Everdrive, the N8 Pro, easily the best NES flash cart at the time of this recording. It does an excellent job of playing your standard NES and Famicom releases, but while I was setting it up, I also discovered that there's so much more to do with it. So today I want to talk about a bunch of cool and obscure games to check out on your Everdrive N8 Pro. These recommendations will be broken up across 5 categories: pirates, unlicensed, disk system, ROM hacks, and other stuff. Number 1. Pirates. It shouldn't be too shocking that this was one of the first things I looked into since I've devoted so much of my channel to talking about them. But yeah, the Everdrive actually has decent compatibility with pirate games. It's not perfect, mind you. Certain games, like the impressive RPGs from Jinkata, are only able to boot to the title screen before becoming unplayable. But many of the heavy hitters, including DKC4, Link to the Past, Pokemon Yellow, and the ultra-rare and mega-expensive complete version of Super Mario World, seem to run perfectly. The best thing about compatibility, though, is that it isn't set in stone. There's always the potential that more games will be supported in the future via firmware updates. There was even one fairly recently in December 2020 that added support for quite a few games. In my opinion, this is the best way to play these games on actual hardware, given how unreliable and sometimes expensive bootlegs can be. Here's a few I'd recommend that work with the current firmware version 2.11. Aladdin Working Music. Hummer Team's Aladdin is an all-time classic among pirate games, featuring gameplay and graphics that are fair approximations of their Super Nintendo counterparts. That being said, the Aladdin that many of us have played is actually a compromised version that was converted to a different, more common mapper. That conversion broke animations and, more apparently, the music. I can't overstate the difference that having these features restored makes. It really brings the game to a whole other level. Unfortunately, one thing that isn't fixed is the game's button mapping, which puts jump on B for some reason. There's an option in the Everdrive menu to swap A and B, but this actually only seems to work with the Everdrive's menus itself. It's one of the few sour spots of Aladdin, and it would be really cool if there was some way to correct this with the Everdrive in the future. Super Mario World Complete Version. As many of my loyal viewers are no doubt aware, there are 2 versions of Hummer Team's 8-bit demake of Super Mario World. The version you're most likely to run across on cartridge is incomplete, ending after only the 4th castle. The second is absurdly more rare, but features twice as many levels, leading all the way to Bowser's Castle. Judging by the unused content found in the incomplete version's ROM, this longer version is the game as Hummer Team always intended it to be, and is therefore essential for any fan of pirate games. Where Dad Went To. Here's one that's just for fun. This is a graphical hack of Adventure Island 2 that's just too bizarre not to mention. It's based on the Chinese adaptation of a South Korean reality show titled Where Are We Going, Dad? Now, I don't know much about the TV series, but if the game is anything to go by, it sees children running around a series of tropical islands and freeing the titular dads from the eggs they are imprisoned in. They can then ride around on the dad and make use of their special ability. This game first appeared to the best of my knowledge on the Cool Boy range of multicarts, which, despite their impressive game selection, are also prone to dying very quickly. Now with the N8, we can enjoy both this and its pseudo-companion game Boonie Bear 2 far into the future. Tiny Toon Adventures 6. In retrospect, maybe I didn't need to include 3 games by the same developer in this section, but I couldn't resist talking about what might be the most impressive game under Hummer Team's belt, and one that doesn't get much attention either. This unofficial port of Tiny Toon Adventures Bab's Big Break is a rare example of a pirate NES game that actually is more visually impressive than the game it's based on, since the original in this case was a Game Boy game. Aside from the title screen, I'd say this game lacks almost anything that would give it away as unofficial at a glance. And hey, it doesn't play half bad either. Super Contra 7. I find this game to be pretty unique among NES pirates in that it's an original scenario using the pirated property, rather than a port. It's not amazing gameplay-wise, with the level design being basic and generally feeling flat. But there are some funny bits here and there, like the famous long "Otel" sign, and the game's overall aesthetic has that distinct Waishin charm that's hard to define, but keeps me returning to it. Number 2. Unlicensed games. This sort of goes hand in hand with the previous list, but it's also something of its own beast, especially on the NES, where the issue of getting these games running is unfortunately not as straightforward as many of us would like it to be, with the lockout chip being a bit of a pain sometimes. Now you can enjoy all these games without having to worry about cartridge dongles, weird peripherals, or sketchy voltage spikes to knock out the CIC lockout chip. Magic Jewelry 2. You could definitely argue that this is just a columns pirate, but I see it as being more of a clone, and either way I feel I have to talk about what is one of my favorite puzzle games on 8-bit Nintendo hardware. This is a simple falling blocks puzzler that has you trying to line up 3-piece rows of jewelry to clear them. It is extremely laid back, which I feel complements the high contrast, almost neon light visuals rather well. You really can't go wrong with Magic Jewelry 1 or 2, but 2 is an improvement in just about every way, featuring selectable tile sets and even a 2-player mode, making for the best way to play the NES's second most addictive puzzle game after Tetris. Dizzy the Adventurer. To be honest, I don't care much for Dizzy as a franchise. I've just never been able to get into any of the games despite enjoying the adventure game genre and even other adventure games from Dizzy publisher Codemasters. Still, I'd recommend giving this game a try as it's the single title exclusive to the Aladdin Deck Enhancer, and is pretty much the only reason to own one unless you're a weirdo who likes collecting obscure stuff like this just for the hell of it. And who knows, maybe you'll even end up liking the game. Pac-Mania. There are plenty of Pac-Men on the NES, but the nature of these games usually means that these ports are lacking in some way. The proportions and speed are all wrong on the original, as well as the licensed version of Miss Pac-Man. The unlicensed version of Miss Pac-Man plays in a way that feels more true to the arcade version but requires a scrolling maze to achieve this, which isn't ideal. For this reason, Pac-Mania is probably the most true to the arcade experience you can get from the series, aside from maybe Pac-Land. And that's because this game already has a scrolling screen in the arcade version. Accuracy aside, the gameplay is really solid. Being able to jump over ghosts is so freeing, and the isometric view still feels unique among the countless entries to the series that have come since. Action 52. Perhaps the most infamous of the NES's unlicensed catalog, the N8 has actually supported this game's mapper for a while, but it wasn't until the N8 Pro that it could support the ROM's relatively massive size. There are 52 games included after all. This definitely falls into the novelty category as the games themselves are really bad, but it's nice to be able to play them if you want, without having to worry about the signature burning cartridge smell. I personally think everyone needs to experience Cheetah Men at least once, just to say they have. For better or worse, some of these games have become iconic in their own right, and can't be ignored by the aspiring retro games enthusiast. Something else that's kind of amazing to think about is that back in the day, after adjusting for inflation, Action 52 would have cost around 2 times as much as the N8 Pro. Pyramid 2. Essentially, this is Tetris, but with triangles, and not much more. The original Pyramid seems to have gained something of a negative reputation online for its unfair gameplay, and it's not totally undeserved. Pyramid 2, however, has been rebalanced, and appears to have removed one of the more troublesome pieces, making for a much smoother experience. It's nothing revolutionary, but it's a fun Tetris alternative if you aren't in the mood for Magic Jewelry. And it also has a pretty interesting story. Number 3. Famicom Disk System. Not only can the Everdrive play a metric ton of cartridge-based games, it can also play the much smaller but still essential library of games released for Nintendo's floppy disk drive, the Famicom Disk System. In my opinion, this is a complete replacement for one of Nintendo's most error-prone pieces of hardware, whether it's a broken drive belt, trouble reading discs, or even the discs themselves having gone bad, as is the case with my copy of 3D Hot Rally. You don't have to worry about this with the N8 Pro. It even includes a feature that auto-detects when to flip the disc, though you can also manually flip it by pressing a button on the top of the cart. Eggerland Sauza e no Tabadachi, or Eggerland Departure to Creation. So here's something that caught me off guard. As far as I can tell, not a single Adventures of Lolo game that was released to consoles in Japan was brought over to the US. Even entries that appear to be the same at a glance actually contain wildly different levels. This is probably because the first Adventures of Lolo that was released in the US takes many of its levels from this game. In fact, you can think of Departure to Creation as a weird prototype of the first game, with some levels that would also appear in the US version of Adventures of Lolo 2, and even a few all to itself. What really makes this game interesting though is that it's one of only a handful of games exclusive to the Disc Writer kiosk service, and was therefore never sold as a full retail release. Doki Doki Panic. At this point, does this game really need any introduction? As I'm sure we're all more than aware by now, this is the original version of the game that we would all come to know and love as NES play-action football. Just like that game, you pluck turnips, jump on Shy Guys, and fight Birdo. But there are some different gameplay quirks like the absence of a run button, graphical differences, and sound enhancements from the FDS hardware. Versus Excitebike. Excitebike is undoubtedly a classic from the NES's early days, but it hasn't aged the best. Frankly, the game is a little bit boring, and due to a lack of any practical way to save your game, creating custom tracks feels kinda like a waste. Versus Excitebike addresses all these problems by adding more modes, including the titular Versus mode, as well as saving thanks to the writability of discs. All this makes for a game that's basically a full replacement for the original. All Night Nippon Super Mario Bros. This is an example of a game from Mario's formative years where Nintendo wasn't afraid to release a pretty simple ROM hack of the original game where Mario kills Japanese celebrities. It's pretty strange. In some ways it takes its cues from the arcade version of SMB titled Versus Super Mario Bros., including a handful of levels from the Lost Levels mixed in with the original ones. But it also does a lot more than that game. Its physics and tile set, for example, are also heavily based on the Lost Levels. It even goes so far as to include 4 secret bonus worlds for completing the game 8 times. Definitely the most unique official way to re-experience SMB1 on the NES. The Mysterious Murasame Castle. When discussing the FDS, this game is usually grouped in with Zelda, Metroid, and Kid Icarus as a major first-party release from the add-on's first year. But unlike those games, Murasame Castle never made it onto a cartridge in the West. Despite visually reminding me of the legendarily bad game Iki, this exudes Nintendo quality. It sort of feels like a more action-oriented Zelda, and graphically hits somewhere in between the early NES and the truly impressive graphics of the latter days of the system. Number 4. ROM Hacks. Perhaps the biggest draw of the Everdrive is the ability to play games that were not commercially released on actual hardware, or something close to it in my case, giving us endless new ways to play some of the greatest games of all time, and even some more obscure titles. The N8 Pro's ability to load one of the most complex and popular Zelda ROM hacks, Legend of Link, is especially enticing. Not for the game itself actually, to be honest I found it pretty boring, but because it gives people an option to play this on real hardware that doesn't require destroying uncommon games for donor parts. Super Mario Bros. 3 Mix. I can't overstate how difficult it is for a ROM like this to win me over. They have to walk the line between challenging enough to keep me engaged, and not so hard that I want to give up. They need to introduce new ideas, and make sure they're fleshed out enough to justify their inclusion as more than a gimmick. And perhaps most importantly, they can't plagiarize their level designs from existing games. 3 Mix comes dangerously close to failing at that last point, but as the game unfolds into a celebration of Mario's history, it becomes more forgivable, and there are more than enough wholly original and sufficiently remixed levels to get a pass. Galaxy's anti-gravity mechanics, Sunshine's Chucksters, the bunny ears from Mario Land 2, and most importantly Yoshi, are all here and feel true to their source material. It even has a good amount of replayability, featuring the star coins from the new Super games. Even though, much like those games, I probably don't have the patience to find them all. It's truly the shining example of a Mario ROM hack done right. Super Mario World, Sonic the Hedgehog, Final Fantasy VII, and Pokemon Yellow improvement hacks. So I'm going to cheat now and talk about 4 hacks at once. Something that almost never happens in the games industry is remakes or reworkings of games that were bad or in some way unsuccessful. In the world of ROM hacking, however, these games give talented artists and programmers the perfect chance to show off their prowess while making something as good as it always could have been. I've talked about the Pirate SMW improvement hack in the past, and while I stand by the fact that this version introduces some problems of its own, it's undoubtable that this would have gone down as a major achievement in gaming had this been the version that released back in the mid-90s. The Somari improvement just straight up changes the game back to being Sonic, and was able to do the unthinkable and make Somari not just playable, but a lot of fun, and is nothing but a straight upgrade over the original. Then you have Final Fantasy VII, which is one of the most striking from the get-go, and seems like a love letter to the PS1 game that fans really should give a try, especially if you were a little let down by the plotting and overly difficult nature of the original Shenzhen Nanjing version. And then finally you have Pokemon Yellow. This is the definitive Pokemon RPG compatible with the Everdrive at this time. Not only has it been fully translated into English like the FF7 improvement, but new, more accurate music was added and balancing changes made so that the game is much more playable. This is truly a gift to Pokemon and pirate game fans alike. Zelda Curse from the Outskirts. So I recently learned that this one might be sort of nostalgic for people who were big into emulation 10-ish years ago, like I was. I played this game a handful of times as a kid, but found it to be too difficult at the time, and it faded from memory until a recent livestream where it came up randomly. Replaying it now, I find this to be a pretty fun but unexceptional SMB1 ROM hack, elevated by its aesthetic. The level designs feel pretty well balanced, but do begin to skew much closer to the vanilla game as you go along. It's the Zelda visuals that really make this one. Mother 25th Anniversary. As someone who struggles getting into RPGs, I wear it as sort of a badge of honor that I've completed all 3 games in the Mother series. It's easily my favorite RPG franchise, but for as much as I love all the games, Mother 1 can be pretty rough. It has all the trappings of early NES RPGs, and the minor improvements of the official US localization, while wonderful, are not enough to save it from being pretty grindy and overly difficult. Mother 25th Anniversary aims to fix much of this, while also giving the game a fresh coat of paint. I can safely say this will be how I replay the game next time I get the itch, but more importantly, this might finally make the game accessible to those who were scared off by it initially. Versus Super Mario Bros. Home version. If you're like me and need yet more ways to play the original SMB, this one might be the most novel that you can try with the Everdrive. There were 2 main forms of NES arcade hardware, the PlayChoice 10, which was more or less just coin-operated stock NES games on a timer, and the Versus system, which sported special versions of select NES games that made them more suited to the arcade environment in some way. Since Versus system games are basically running on NES hardware, it's possible to hack the ROMs to get them running on a consumer NES. And that's what you have here. The options that would normally be handled by the dip switches on the arcade board are now selectable at the menu upon startup, and inserting coins is handled by the select button. The game itself is largely the same, with slightly remixed, harder level layouts, and some courses that would make their way into the lost levels. Number 5. Other stuff. So far we've only scratched the surface of what there is to play. You also have homebrew games, prototypes, and even some things that don't seem to cleanly fall into any category. All of this sums up to perhaps the largest catalog of any home console ever, and one that continues to grow. Sunman. Originally envisioned as a Superman game, this game likely would have been celebrated along with Sunsoft's other licensed DC games as an NES classic had it released, and had they not seemingly lost the license. Superman is a hard character to portray correctly in games. One of his main attributes, being able to fly for example, could completely break a poorly designed level. Somehow, the game's able to pull it off though. This is one of the more completely realized unreleased games on the NES, and it's incredibly fortunate that we have access to this ROM. Bomb Sweeper. This is a fan port of what might be my favorite Game & Watch game. It's a little strange to want to play something like this on a big screen, what with its lack of any real animation and simplistic single-screen gameplay. But it's also a game that's easy to get sucked into. For those who don't know, your goal is to manipulate a maze by pushing its walls so that you can reach and defuse a bomb within a time limit. The original Game & Watch version is pretty easy and can even start to get a little repetitive after around the 10th round. The NES version, on the other hand, keeps things fresh and starts to get genuinely difficult after a bit. This might have actually become my favorite way to play Bomb Sweeper, and has me interested in other potential Game & Watch ports. Blade Buster. This is one of the most graphically impressive homebrews I've seen on the NES. It's a shooter played caravan style. That's to say you have 2 or 5 minutes to get the highest score possible. It's standard vertical shooter gameplay that's elevated by touches like parallax scrolling and large boss sprites. Pac-Man Championship Edition. When Namco Museum's Archives Volume 1 was announced for Switch, I thought it was kinda cool but didn't see the broad appeal of a collection of NES ports of arcade games. What did have me raising an eyebrow though, was the inclusion of a demake of Pac-Man Championship Edition. As cool as it seemed, I never would have guessed that this demake was an actual NES ROM that you could run on actual hardware. The original Championship is the best Pac-Man ever by a large margin, and likewise the demake is the best of the series on the NES. It's a visual trip with gameplay that's fast, fluid, and fair even with necessary changes like screen scrolling. The devs even went as far as to include achievements in this version and a working save feature. This is sort of a special case where if you plan to load this onto your Everdrive, I would also recommend supporting the devs by purchasing the game on console or PC as well. Gapless. Just like the first, the second volume in the Namco Museum Archive series came with a newly developed NES port, and this one is much more of a deep cut, I feel. This is the third game in the series which started with Galaxian and was preceded by Galaga. But it's often left out of the discussion when talking about these games, which is a shame because it may be the best one. It's basically just Galaga but bigger, where in Galaga you could only have a double shot, in Gapless you can have over 5 by recruiting enemy attackers to your side. There's more variety to how each stage plays out, more power-ups, and a more involved bonus stage. This also might just take the cake for the most accurate feeling and looking arcade port on the whole console. I'm really hoping that this might be a sign of things to come. I can only imagine what an official modern-day 8-bit Mario game might look like, for example. Well, I think that wraps things up for now, but I do plan to return at a future date to talk about what's possible on the Super Nintendo with the SD to SNES, and the N64 with the Everdrive 64X7. It's clear to me that flash carts will become an indispensable resource for game preservation in the long term, and it's reassuring to see how far the technology has come in a pretty short amount of time. In a couple years, I don't think it's unreasonable to expect much closer to full mapper support, and perhaps even the implementation of features that go far beyond what the original hardware was intended to do. Shoutouts to my Tier 4 patron Famicom Pony.